Hi, Ian here. One of the things that I would really like you to do is that when you open any sort of map, is not just to behave like some tourist going through a new area or some technician that's just treating this as a purely technical problem. I want you to start thinking like a GIS analyst, like a true geographical information professional. Okay, so I want you to think about, what some of these shapes in the map might sort of suggest. What some of the problems that might emerge from by looking at the shapes of an area. So what we're going to do is we're going to open this cadastral map. Now, cadastre, we go to this button here to add vector layer. Okay, and we go browse. And of course, you've extracted these files to your desktop or whatever, but it's in this Learn Practical GIS qGIS for Newbies directory or folder structure. And we open this file called cadastre. Now, cadastre is a map of property ownership or land ownership or parcels, properties, whole bunch of sort of terms like that. And it might contain rating information, but they're basically, you'll hear me go on and on and on about the scale of a map relates to the scale of its collection rather than the scale of its display. Okay, now that's a very, very important point when you're dealing with GIS maps. However, there's exceptions to this, and one of the exceptions, not always, but quite often, are cadastral maps. Because they're maps of legal property boundaries, they tend to be surveyed in by professional surveyors. Now, this is not going to be the case everywhere. In rural areas, or the GIS technology hasn't quite settled in and settled into and so forth, you're likely to have maps that aren't as accurate, and that is quite true. But where you have an established urban environment, more often than not, the GIS maps there are surveyed GIS maps. So they relate to legal property boundaries. Okay, so that over, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about some of the shapes that we see in here. Okay, so this is an area of around about 100 square kilometres. I haven't actually measured it, but it's about 13 kilometres by around 10 at its extremes. So that would say, it's around, let's say, 40 square miles. Okay, so the first thing I see here, I see some very densely developed areas. Right, some urban areas. I see some less urban areas. Okay, so you've got some very small blocks, right? And you've got some perhaps rural residential blocks because you can see the outlines in here. And you've got some rural areas here. Okay. So what are the sorts of issues that are likely to be going on with these sorts of areas? Okay, so in urban areas, you're going to have things like schools. Are there and census-related themes that relate to schools? Are there enough young people to support the schools? There's going to be the standard council or local government sorts of issues like, garbage collection routes and so forth. There's going to be infrastructure in the ground, such as water infrastructure, drainage infrastructure. Where is this telecommunications infrastructure? A whole bunch of issues like that. How does local government rate these properties? Who owns the property? They're the sorts of issues that are going to be going on. There's a whole bunch more, but that's just touching the edge. So when we get into these rural residential areas, what are the transport sort of problems or issues that are going on, or what are the provision of services? How are services provided? Services, once again, such as schools and so forth, garbage services. Because the blocks are bigger, they're less intense development, and there'll be a whole bunch of sort of issues like that going on. And of course, also potentially when you get rural residential areas, you get different land, you get hobby farms. So what are the sorts of issues that are going on with hobby farms? People having horses on there and so forth. But these areas here, of course, adjoin or abut quite rural areas by the looks of it. So what's going on there? Are these farms, or are they public open space, or are these farms viable to use because they're so close to urban areas? Because a lot of urban uses conflict with rural uses. You tend to find is that years ago this area here, this whole area here, would have been probably farmland, most of it, and people could spray their pesticides to their heart's content, spread their animal manures to their heart's content. But you start getting an urban area next to that, and the people start going, oh gee, we don't want spray drift over our home, or we don't like the smell of your fertilizer on a Saturday morning, and things like that. So there's those sorts of issues going on. And of course, there will be issues, potentially these areas are supplying food to these urban areas, the rural areas here. So how do we keep these rural areas sustainable agriculture? All these policy issues. Another thing I see here is I see shapes, right? A lot of these blocks, see up here, all the blocks are square, right? But why are they rounded? So there'll be issues here relating to these rounded shapes. And these rounded shapes, more than likely, are water bodies. Okay, so these will be swamps, because I don't really see too much drainage going on. We can see some fairly major drainage things going on here, and inlets and so forth down here. But I don't see those in these areas. So there's going to be a whole bunch of issues about urban areas draining into here, potentially these areas smelling, potentially the critters in here moving in to these urban areas and protecting the urban areas from critters, and protecting the critters from the urban areas. So there's these sorts of conflicts that are potentially going on. The other thing I see is shapes down here that suggest to me that this is coastline. Of course, well, I put this course together, so I know it's coastline, but even if I didn't know that, I would be thinking, oh my goodness, that's obviously an inlet there, and there's coast going on in here. There's going to be issues relating to development along the coast, stability of sand dunes, a whole bunch of things like that. There's going to be issues of urban runoff going into these inlets. So how do we protect these inlets from poor quality stormwater? There's going to be issues here. If I look at the shape of this, see, a bay area like this, or an inlet area like this, is quite different than an open area of coastline, such as this, all right? Because these areas don't flush as much or as easily. So there's going to be issues of stormwater hanging around. There's going to be issues of these water quality issues. There's going to be issues of people wanting access to these water bodies, like for boating and recreation and so forth. There are so many things that you can tell just by looking at a map like this. And here's another one. Look at this wide, it's obviously a road reserve, and it's obviously for a major freeway. So this is saying here that there's some sort of transport connection. Like if it's a freeway, it's going to mean, well, gee, there's a major freeway going through here, or a major road. Potentially this opens this area up for transport-related services and so forth. Warehousing, storage, and all these sorts of pressures that are going to be placed on the area. Commercial uses along the main road, and so forth. So I can tell a whole bunch of things just by looking at the shape of this map. And I want you to start thinking about these maps in these terms, because once again, if you think you're just going to get a technology project or a technology lesson from me, it's not quite what you're going to get. I see the technology as a tool for a GIS analyst to use, and I want you to start thinking of yourself as a GIS analyst rather than a GIS technician, because a GIS analyst is going to produce maps that are far, far more useful than just a pure GIS technician. And it's not to say that there's not places for GIS technicians, but I'd like you to think of yourself as a GIS analyst. Anyway, that's me signing off for now.